Okay. All right. Good afternoon. Sorry for the delay a little bit. We are getting started now. Welcome to everyone joining us today, both online and back on campus for the final presentation this academic year in our ASRI Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Taylor Zavitz. I'm a sessional instructor and PhD candidate here at the University of Victoria and an Animals and Society Research Initiative Graduate Student Fellow. ASRI is a research forum and working group at the University of Victoria for those interested in the critical examination of normalized practices and conceptualizations of human-animal interspecies relations. For more information about ASRI, please visit our website, and Holly will be posting the link on the Zoom chat for those who are online today, as well as an email address for ASRI if you'd like to join our listserv and stay up to date with monthly emails on news and events. We acknowledge the generous funding by the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy for this lecture series. Thanks also to our co-presenter at the University of Victoria for this lecture, the Center for Global Studies. We also acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wassanic peoples whose historical relations with the land continue to this day. Today, we have the honor of welcoming Dr. Jodey Castricano, presenting under the title Bearing Witness, Animal Loss in the Anthropocene. Dr. Castricano is Professor of English and Cultural Studies at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, and is also a Research Fellow, Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. Dr. Castricano has published 3 books on the issues relevant to critical animal studies: Animal Subjects, An Ethical Reader in a Post-Human World, and Animal Subjects 2.0, co-edited with Lauren Corman, which builds on the previous work in the field of critical animal studies and posthumanism. Another book published in 2016 and co-edited with Rasmus Simonsen is Critical Perspectives on Veganism, a collection of essays that examine the ethics, politics, and aesthetics of veganism in contemporary culture and thought. We will have time following the lecture for a question and answer period. So for those of you online, please post your questions to the chat and we will read them out in conjunction with questions here in the room. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jodey Castricano.
Thank you, Taylor. This has been thank you very much also for that warm welcome and for the generous introduction, particularly since this has been 2 years in the making. Okay, this talk is called Bearing Witness, Animal Loss in the Anthropocene, and there's also a subtitle that hasn't yet appeared. The subtitle is something said by Catherine Gillespie: "You can't grieve for 50 billion animals at once and contain that grief." This talk on bearing witness to animal loss in the Anthropocene hinges on the salutary truth that while humanity is now said to be influencing every aspect of the earth on a scale akin to the great forces of nature, that influence has had grave consequences for other animals with whom we share this planet. Perhaps by now, and in spite of climate change denials, most will agree we've been changing the world around us for millennia, although the scale and spread of change in the last 60 years has led scientists to call events since the 1950s the Great Acceleration, and more recently, in reference to animal loss, the 6th mass extinction. At this moment, the message could not be more clear. There can no longer be any reasonable doubt that climate change is anthropogenic, and furthermore, that it is an unrelenting driver of mass extinction. It should come as no surprise, therefore, when we're told we lose another species to extinction every 30 minutes and 70% of wildlife species have already been lost to climate change in the surge of extractivist capitalism. In noting the anthropogenic reality of mass extinction, Wendy Wiseman draws attention to the fact that extractivist capitalism has been instrumental in, quote, the annihilation of millions of our fellow animals. Indeed, in response to mass extinction, scientists, environmentalists, and policymakers continue to issue facts and statistics regarding the measure of animal loss. For example, one biodiversity data site on extinction reports, quote, more than 99% of 4 billion species that have evolved on Earth are now gone. At least 900 species have gone extinct in the last 5 centuries. Given that by definition, data are measured, collected, reported, and analyzed, it's hard to grasp the reality of animal loss when presented in terms of graphs, tables, numbers. Increasingly, and perhaps in response to such cognitive gaps, the environmental humanities, including ecofeminism, has responded to the urgent call to bear witness to the loss of other animals, even as we are told their numbers are in the millions, if not billions. In response to the call to bear witness, humanities scholars assert that attempts to convey the meaning of these losses requires us to develop, as Wiseman puts it, a transformational ethics grounded in empathy and kinship, which is what I think feminist philosopher Kelly Oliver means when she calls for an ethics grounded in relationality and responsivity. This relational grounding and ability to respond also appears to be what Manisha Deka has in mind when drawing upon the blended insights from feminist animal care theory and call and response ethics as a way of making us accountable to animals at a foundational level. And of course, for Deka, this means also beyond personhood and understanding animals as legal beings. Indeed, the need to be accountable increasingly and necessarily includes the question of bearing witness to the loss of innumerable living beings, while at the same time, we are challenged by the question, how to hold such overwhelming numbers of beings in our minds? How is it possible to bear empathetic witness to mass extinction, especially where massification entails another kind of violence? I simply am unable to convey the meaning of such loss by offering more data, which is why this talk aims to speak of that meaning by taking a circuitous route through storytelling as a medium of holding space for empathy and kinship, while at the same time coming to terms with what Derrida has called the war on pity, and what Carol J. Adams has referred to as the war on compassion. And such an approach will take us into a certain encounter with animals that always already have been in play regarding the anthropocentric status of the human subject. This talk, which is a kind of thought experiment, involves storytelling, including one of Nietzsche, the philosopher who disparaged of compassion and his encounter with the horse of Turin, and Jacques Derrida and his little cat, Logos. But to begin, I'd like to reflect upon the challenge to making us accountable to animals and to acknowledging their loss. The first challenge amounts to catching sight of an anthropocentric sleight of hand that often renders moot any bearing witness to animal loss and risks reiterating human interests. What I mean is that when talking about animal loss, we often focus on anthropogenesis, while one by one, millions of animals disappear into data. A phenomenon which seems to be what Emily Thu is getting at when in monstrous metaphors theorizing the non-human and lost narratives, she says that more often than not, in talking about the Anthropocene, quote, the non-human vanishes from the narrative, or perhaps more accurately, quote, is pushed out of the frame. Similarly, a further challenge to witnessing emerges when we are called upon to recognize that our always already entanglement with a more than human world complicates the act of witnessing. David Wallace Wells reflects upon such entanglements in The Uninhabitable Earth, saying that one does not live outside the scene, but within it, subject to all the same horrors you can see afflicting the lives of animals. So further to sharing the same horrors, the challenge to bearing witness takes another turn when it raises the question of how to develop empathy for those vanishing or already vanished from view, or how to be accountable to other animals who are spoken of in mass terms, unless, like Cecil, the lion, they achieve celebrity status and become synecdoche for the precipitous decline of all lions in the wild due to trophy hunting. Indeed, a report by the Humane Society International entitled Trophy Hunting by the Numbers draws upon Cecil's death to observe that hundreds of thousands of wild animals, including endangered or threatened species, are slain around the globe by trophy hunters each year. In this context, even an appeal to species loss rests upon the quote, the tendency, as Marty Keel says, to view other than human animals as aggregate categories rather than individuals. As Keel points out, aggregation sends a message that other than human animals, perhaps even Cecil, are interchangeable or irreplaceable, whereas human beings, unless they too are Cecil, as the shirt indicates, are unique and unviolable. This substitutive effect is often always already at play in reducing the singularity of a living being to a concept that valorizes the privilege and identity of the anthropos, while withholding from the animal, as Derrida says, the unsubstitutable existence that refuses to be conceptualized. Such refusals are precarious in that, as Derrida says, the confusion of all non-human living creatures within the general and common category of the animal is not simply a sin against rigorous thinking, vigilance, lucidity, or empirical authority. It is also a crime, not a crime against animality precisely, but a crime of the first order against the animals, against animals. The anthropocentric point regarding such confusions is emphasized further by Derrida with regards reference to the animal, a loaded term to which Derrida has a vigorous response saying, animal, what a word. He explains his reaction saying, animal is a word that men have given themselves the right to give. These humans are found giving it to themselves, this word, but as if they had received it as an inheritance. They have given themselves the word in order to conceal or corral a large number of living beings within a single concept, the animal, they say. To follow Derrida, we can see how counterintuitive it might be in developing forms of kinship with other beings, especially when these are beings collectively absorbed under the sign animal, which is conceptual and discursively opposite that which is human. The same corralling occurs with aggregation or mathematization. If we're called upon to bear witness to the annihilation of millions of our fellow animals and are told these losses amount to extinction every 30 minutes, we're handed a conceptual overload. How to hold such overwhelming numbers of beings in our minds. In the words of acclaimed photojournalist Joanne MacArthur, whose work over the past 20 years is dedicated to making the plight of individual animals visible, a billion animals is not a billion animals. A billion animals is one individual, and then another, and then another, and again, another. Furthermore, aggregation creates cognitive dissonance, and that, as MacArthur says, our ability to empathize recedes as the numbers increase. Indeed, as Carol J. Adams puts it, massification of beings permits the dilution, the diminution of our attention. A further consequence of massification is that in calling for concern, it ironically draws attention away from the lives and concerns of animals themselves, and often leaves in its wake the subtle and sometimes not so subtle impression, as Adams asserts, that animals do not matter to themselves, even though they die as individuals. And yet again, we're called upon to bear witness to animal loss. A precursor to that call is the question, what does it mean to bear witness in the first place? How does one bear witness to animal loss when its extinction itself is not, as Adam Searle asserts, a moment or a singular event? Even the promise of de-extinction, with its claims to offer the right application of bioengineering to ameliorate animal loss, is profoundly hubristic and disingenuous, since within the purview of cloning technoscience, the bioengineered are no longer living beings, but are reduced to genetic codes, which are subject to semiotic programming in an effort to bring out a return from the dead. The cloned can be created over and over again with techniques such as the cloning of Dolly. The method being to use electrical pulses to fuse the mammary cell with an unfertilized egg cell, the nucleus of which has been removed, we're told. Dolly was the only lamb to have survived to adulthood from 277 attempts. Of the anonymous and aggregated others, nothing is said. Currently on display in the Science and Technology Gallery at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, a taxidermied Dolly rotates slowly and somehow interminably on a circular dais beneath the glider planes representing aviation history, which hang from the ceiling. I'm here on a rainy afternoon in Edinburgh, and I'm surprised to see Dolly turning on the dais. No one is looking at her. That is, they pass beneath the dais on their way elsewhere, still not looking. I watch them as they pass. Later, I learned if you can't make it to the museum, quote, don't worry, Dolly the sheep has been scanned and digitally reconstructed as a 3D model. We're told, quote, to take her for a spin and see her like never before. Beyond Dolly, current efforts to clone a woolly mammoth involve trying to grow a hybrid animal with woolly mammoth traits using an artificial womb. So clearly, bearing witness is complicated. Significantly, in drawing attention to the precarity involved in witnessing the suffering of animals who live and die as commodities and to whom little regard is paid, Gillespie makes the point that more often than not, far less value or significance is placed on witnessing their loss, especially when their lives are aggregated. And of course, these are the other individuals that we're considering during the Anthropocene. Gillespie says, you try to comprehend it, to contain it. You witness one animal suffering and dying before your eyes, and you know that one is billions. The scale of it is uncontainable. You can't grieve for 50 billion animals at once and contain that grief. Indeed, Gillespie's assertion that each face requires you to become the witness should tell us not only what gets lost when we attempt to bear witness to mass extinctions, but also what's at stake in attempting to do so. For as Gillespie puts it, in order to witness, one must learn to, quote, contain feelings of madness, not eliminate them, but contain them, which is exacerbated when we face the politics of the dismissive. If anything, it's clear, it's that Gillespie is drawing attention to affective witnessing, which includes a profound admixture of grief, anger, and even helplessness, as well as awareness of the fact such emotional responses to animal suffering, death, and loss are often derailed by the notion of species barriers and trivialized. At the same time of the Anthropocene, bearing witness to loss requires us to mourn by cultivating forms of empathy. But how does one mourn and empathize when historically affect is relegated, as I said, to the politics of the dismissive? In what follows, I want to reflect further upon the idea that bearing witness to the loss of animal lives requires us to hold space, not merely for the question of the animal, but rather the question of an animal, each one in his or her singularity, one that is deeply embedded or enfleshed, as are we in the sensate world. To do so, I'll first address the certain anthropocentric deficiencies in a philosophical tradition, Western philosophical tradition, that has aligned itself with the rejection of affect, all the while remaining haunted by animals, oddly enough, in their singularity. Indeed, the point will be to draw attention to the philosophical imperative, recalling Derida, to wage a war on compassion, which involves the delegitimization of affect as an authentic political response to the suffering and loss of animal lives. In other words, a major challenge to cultivating empathy in response to animal loss in the Anthropocene is, as Laurie Gruen points out, the fact that in philosophy, affect or sentiment has stood in opposition to reason in judgments of value, as well as in perceptions of good and bad, right and wrong. And that opposition finds its way into the legal status of animals, especially those who are farmed and often not seen as being victims of the Anthropocene. One way to get around or to complicate this opposition is by storytelling, and more specifically, I would say it's the storytelling that haunts philosophy. So let's imagine it is the morning of January 3rd, 1889 in Turin, Italy. A driver of a hansom cab on the Piazza Carlo Alberto is now flogging a horse, who in spite of the man's relentless urgings with the whip, refuses or is unable to move. Now imagine a man who has been watching from inside a house steps out of the doorway of number 6, Via Carlo Alberto, runs to the horse and visibly distraught, throws his arms around the horse's neck in what seems a vain attempt to protect the creature from being beaten, and the man begins to weep inconsolably. Now you'll know there was no image there, but you saw it, right? The man who is brought home by a neighbor is, as the story goes, Friedrich Nietzsche. Distraught beyond measure, he then lies speechless for 2 days before uttering his last words, Mutter, ich bin dumm. Nietzsche lives for another decade, cared for by his mother and sisters, silent and demented. Of the horse's fate, nothing is known. It can surely be imagined, however. In the wake of this moment, let's fast forward to somewhere between 1997 and 2003, when another philosopher, Jacques Derrida, describes a moment of being naked in the presence of a cat, his cat, a little cat with whom he lived. You thought there was going to be an image of Derrida naked? No. And becoming aware as he was looking that he was being looked at, not by some, quote, exemplar of a species called cat, even less so, he says, of an animal genus or kingdom, but as Derrida says, this irreplaceable being that encounters me. To make the point, Derrida says this little cat's existence, quote, refuses to be conceptualized and does not appear here to represent, like an ambassador, the immense symbolic responsibility with which our culture has always charged the feline race. Rather, in pointing out that logos is a real cat, marks the little cat's unsubstitutable singularity. Such an encounter has the effect of undermining the universalism or abstraction that reduces animal life, that makes witnessing implausible. At this moment, Derrida's epiphany has profound implications for anthropocentrism in that he realizes that being looked at by the specific cat, even looked at by quote unquote an animal, is almost never the vantage point from which animals are talked about in both science and philosophy. Two forms of knowledge making that have sustained a supposedly objective and unidirectional gaze upon the animal. We can reflect upon the little cat's perception of Derrida as well as the experience of the horse of Turin, and that might be a story philosophy prefers to keep under wraps. For Derrida, however, and quite possibly for Nietzsche, we understand how the so-called question of an animal is a motif that draws attention to aspects of animal life that have been most forgotten or scorned by philosophy. If Bentham asked of animals, can they suffer? It seems clear that for both Nietzsche and Derrida, the question possesses enormous import, not only for philosophy, but also for us in the Anthropocene by challenging the most constant and tenacious tradition of thinking in the history of philosophy and its denial of entanglement with the more than human world. This is to say that stories of Nietzsche and the horse of Turin to Derrida's cat invite or even challenge us to break with an often overwhelming philosophical and scientific tradition sustained in the names of Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, Heidegger, and even Levinas, all of whom say the same thing in regards to the classical metaphysical project of uncovering and analyzing human essence as distinguished from animal life. This opposition is discursively sustained through the word animal, which, as I mentioned, Derrida contends is an appellation that men have instituted, a name they have given themselves the right and the authority to give to the living other. If we reflect upon that name for a moment, we see how it relies on an ontological slippage to contain human exceptionalism, which has ensured that other living creatures, as Heidegger puts it, are separated from our existence essence by an abyss. On one side of the abyss stands the human, who, even though suffering an abysmal bodily kinship with the beast, is in contrast to animals who are profoundly lacking in world. In this anthropocentric context, to what or to whom does one bear witness when even legal orders often sustain an anthropocentric hierarchy of being? As Derrida and others have made clear, the history of philosophy is replete with such anthropocentric concepts, and most of them traditionally have been aimed at determining an infallible line of demarcation between humans and animals. It seems clear that the current ethical turn regarding the question of the animal follows a relentless deconstruction of anthropocentrism in the wake of Nietzsche. But what is curious is that after Nietzsche, Derrida and the company of ecofeminist legal scholars and others pries open the door of anthropocentrism to usher in compassion, a strange guest, a ghost perhaps, in the house of philosophy. Specifically, in The Animal That Therefore I Am, Derrida evokes the power of pathetic images to open the immense question of pathos and of suffering, pity, and compassion, and the place that it has to be accorded to the interpretation of this compassion. Derrida says, everybody knows what terrifying and intolerable pictures a realist painting could give to the industrial, mechanical, chemical, hormonal, and genetic violence to which man has been submitting animal life for the past 2 centuries. Everybody knows what the production, breeding, transport, and slaughter of these animals has become. Indeed, Derrida goes on, if such images are pathetic, it is because they give us to understand how the act of imagination can inspire profound changes in attitude. Because note, Derrida does not offer an image other than this narrative, which is an image in itself. In storytelling, imagery gives the reader something to see, hear, and feel. In other words, image making in storytelling has evocative power. In the scene involving Nietzsche and the fallen horse, the image is visual, tactile, perhaps even kinesthetic and auditory. In fact, being situational and contextual, the image provocatively draws us into the active circle of being with, which is not just hypothetical, but viscerally engenders compassion when it indicts the long-sanctioned, unquestioned subjection of animals to human authority and control. To appreciate the workings of such image making, one might reflect upon a scene in Coetzee's The Lives of Animals, in which the protagonist, Elizabeth Costello, an author and animal advocate, who has been invited to give a lecture, speaks passionately against the way humans abuse animals and is resisted by all around her, including her own family. During the lecture, Costello finds herself at odds with the philosopher Thomas O'Hearn, who challenges Costello's view on the grounds that, quote, that agitation for animal rights, including the right to life, is abstract, unconvincing, and finally idle, he says. And adding to that, he argues that any intent on being in community with animals is merely wishful thinking, and thus, quote, a piece of prelapsarian wistfulness. His skepticism is particularly evident in response to Costello's call for kindness towards animals that acknowledges our kinship with them. Indeed, O'Hearn's privileging of reason over emotion and his view that valuing animals is merely sentimental and not rational is what informs Costello's reluctance to engage in abstract principles to advocate for the lives of animals. As Alicia Anatola points out, Costello places great emphasis on sympathy, which she calls the capacity to, quote, share the being of another, and which she links with imagination. Costello talks about sympathetic imagination. When O'Hearn challenges Costello whether or not animals value their lives, Costello recognizes the difficulty in communicating an ethics based on sharing the being of another to an academic audience, who, in line with O'Hearn's skepticism, doubts her capacity to make the case based on her unwillingness to engage in theory. In a move that gives us to understand what might be at stake for anthropocentrism in the image of Nietzsche's embrace of the horse of Turin, Costello offers the audience a similar image of vulnerability that encourages being with, She says, if I do not convince you, it is because my words lack the power to bring home to you the wholeness, the unabstracted nature of that animal being. That is why I urge you to walk flank to flank beside the beast that is prodded down the chute to his executioner. In the story of Nietzsche and the horse, and also with Elizabeth Costello, we might agree that compassion can be seen as an act of imagination that has brought us to a critical moment in the Anthropocene. Indeed, as Bernard de Koven writes, compassion involves, quote, an imagination that is not only a part of the way we think, but also a part of the way we sense, the way we experience the other. This experience may well involve the recognition that concern for animals and their loss means an encounter with an animal's inability or incapacity to avoid pain, its fleshly vulnerability and exposure to wounding. It's interesting, this image just came up, the one with the person and the dog. This is from the Ukraine, and this dog is so terrified that he cannot walk, he will not walk anymore. And somehow it also reminds me of the image of Nietzsche and the horse. And the other image is a person had found this little mouse in their basement and nursed the mouse back to health. So it's this kind of vulnerability because the mouse was having a problem based on what was in the basement. I would like to think that this is an encounter with non-power, and it's what brought Nietzsche to his knees. It was a sudden perception or experience of all that was previously unthinkable. What we share with animals as embodied beings. This is to say that sharing the awareness of non-power means to realize the poverty of anthropocentrism and to arrive, as Matthew Calarco might say, at the site where one's egoism is called into question and where compassion is called for. From this site, the fallen horse must be embraced by the philosopher. In this story, or that, the philosopher must see himself observed by his little cat. Therefore, we must ask, given this tradition, what is it that is as yet unthinkable in the house of anthropocentrism? What madness must watch over what is called thinking to keep compassion for other animals out? After all, we know that Nietzsche did indeed have a permanent breakdown in Turin. His street collapse has been attributed to the culmination of a serious mental illness that has been underway for even a few weeks before the morning of January 3rd. While Nietzsche's breakdown has been acknowledged, it's been said on the one hand he suffered from syphilis or brain cancer, and on the other that he experienced a mystical awakening. Similarly, many contend the breakdown is irrelevant to Nietzsche's philosophy, while still others, such as Georges Bataille, argue that breakdown must be considered. In some versions of the event, there is no mention of a horse. Rather, Nietzsche is found lying unconscious on the pavement just after loudly declaring he was the tyrant of Torino and God come among men. Indeed, Nietzsche's breakdown has been the subject of speculation and remains uncertain, and that what took place between Nietzsche and the horse of Turin is as open to speculation as is the distinct possibility the encounter never happened, but here it is. And while ghosts, we could say, are often at the heart of storytelling, the question becomes how to speak to it. I want to step away from the irresolvable either or debate and ask a different question. Namely, even if, or especially if, the story of Nietzsche and the unnamed horse is merely apocryphal, why does it continue to haunt philosophy? Is it that the story of the philosopher's embrace of the unnamed horse seismically destabilizes the anthropocentric tradition by undermining philosophy's dual insistence that human beings and animals are essentially different and that there is an abyss that separates human existence from animal life? Recalling that Nietzsche once said, when one looks into an abyss, the abyss reciprocates by looking back, we can appreciate the moment of undoing of a certain human exceptionalism which wages that war on compassion. Perhaps it is to say that the narrative and the image give us to understand what lies at the heart of Kant's rejection of sentiment or sympathy as an abyss building practice by which there would be nothing to mourn. At the same time, however, the story of Nietzsche and the horse opens anthropocentrism to the enormity of the question of compassion, or the sharing of suffering among the living to the law, ethics, and politics, as Derida says. In other words, bearing witness to animal loss is not merely a matter of observation, rather it demands an experience of being with as a legitimate political practice. In a narrative sense, in a narrative sense, the account of Nietzsche and the horse is a story not of Nietzsche's incipient madness, but of the madness within anthropocentrism itself that has brought us to the threshold of the Anthropocene. Challenging the disavowal of compassion is the image of Nietzsche's embrace and the horse, and the story, apocryphal or not, signals a collapse of that which traditionally separates the human from the animal, whether it be in philosophy, in culture, in law, or in politics. In an anthropocentric worldview that has historically treated the loss of our fellow beings as being part of business as usual. Perhaps in the image, we are thus reminded of what it actually means to cultivate empathy. Does Nietzsche's embrace and the searing image of the embrace not signal an apocalypse, that is, of anthropocentrism and its failure to sustain the thinking required to maintain the human-animal divide? Perhaps the story gestures towards an awareness of what Derida has called the ends of man. When it comes to Nietzsche, some seem undecided but hopeful. For example, in the true story of the Turin horse, or Nietzsche's horse, Aleph says it's tempting to see more in Nietzsche's encounter with the Turin horse than that which is really implied. Sorry if I'm going fast. I realize that with our delay, I got to kind of speed things up a bit, but anyway. This may be especially true in that Nietzsche was always against Schopenhauer's emphasis on the importance of empathy and compassion, a fact which seems to imply a break between Nietzsche and his own thinking, an epiphany perhaps. But among the story's many interpretations in both Dostoevsky and of Nietzsche, there's a sense that violence simply begets more violence and that animals don't deserve our cruelty, in part because they are mirrors of ourselves. Perhaps at long last, Nietzsche really did discover a reverence for human compassion. If Nietzsche did discover this reverence for compassion, it's meaningful and perhaps ironic that it was in relation to a fallen animal, since that embrace reveals to us what Derida has called the abyssal limit of the human. What I've been aiming to do here is to draw attention to the terms of an apocalyptic collapse of the ontological and epistemological distance between the horse and the philosopher, one that constitutes a significant breach of anthropocentrism and perhaps the possibility of coming to an understanding of our relation to the more than human world. While I do not hold the view that animals are mirrors of ourselves, I do believe that the encounter between Nietzsche and the horse and the image it presents can be said to involve an epiphany, one predicated upon compassion and carrying with it an obligation to respond. This is what might be at stake in witnessing and this scene. Perhaps this effect or affect is what Derida has in mind when he says, we are passing through a critical phase. We are passing through that phase. And I would certainly say at this time and at this moment, even standing here at this room, I'm acutely aware of what we are currently facing, not only with regards to the thing called the Anthropocene and with climate change and with everything that goes with it and a pandemic, but also the potential that is there for a third world war. And, this is this part of the phase. We are passing through the phase and it passes through us, says Derida. To think the war, which is so strange that this would appear here, but we find ourselves waging is not only a duty, a responsibility, and an obligation, it is also a necessity, a constraint that, like it or not, directly or indirectly, everyone is held to. Henceforth and more than. And I say to think this war because it concerns what we call thinking. The animal looks at us and we are naked before it. Thinking perhaps begins there. I find that the most incredible thing to say, and I would actually love to do a whole talk just on that. But anyway, to be naked when looked at by an animal is another way of saying one has been made aware of the pretensions inherent to anthropocentrism in upholding what Carrie Wolf has called the fantasy figure of the human. To put this moment in storytelling terms, we might consider Hans Christian Andersen's folktale, The Emperor's New Clothes, in which the willed ignorance of the emperor, as well as that of the entire town, is ruptured when a child exclaims, "But he hasn't got anything on." To return to Derrida remains for us to learn what it means to be passing through this critical phase and think this war without folding ourselves back into an anthropocentric frame that turns the living animal into a cipher, a synecdoche, or a statistic. Instead, we're called upon to cultivate compassion with regards to actual living beings, including ourselves. But instead of anthropocentric conditioning, such thinking means that we arrive at the place that has to be accorded to the interpretation of this compassion, says Derrida, to the sharing of this suffering amongst the living, then to the law, ethics, and politics. This must be brought to bear upon this experience of compassion. What has been happening for 2 centuries now involves a new experience of this compassion. And I would say that that is the case in the sense of 2 centuries, for the very fact that we're having these kinds of talks, that we have this kind of ability to have to speak of this without necessarily the politics of the dismissive. So the story of the encounter between the horse of Turin and Friedrich Nietzsche speaks, as I said, to the power of witnessing as compassionate being with. It recommends a crucial understanding of our always already entangled relations with the more than human world. And in a sense, that such storytelling invites us into a zone of proximity, which is involved in what Deleuze and Guattari call becoming animal, which means a displacement of human exceptionalism and thus a recognition of a relationship between ourselves as other animals as being enfleshed and vulnerable. A moment of such becoming, as Matthew Calarco writes, can be located in the event of being unexpectedly exposed to terrible animal suffering. In other words, the story of Nietzsche and the horse draws into a zone of relationality and responsivity in a moment of becoming. It asks us to become aware of what Carrie Wolf says is a less visible bond between human and non-human animals, as beings who not only live and die as embodied beings, but also communicate with each other in and through a second form of finitude that encompasses the human-animal difference, forming a bond that is all the more powerful because it is, quote, unthinking, and in a fundamental sense, unthinkable. That to me seems to be one of the greatest challenges as we stop separating what we consider thinking from this experience of compassion. Herein, of course, emerges the challenge to acknowledge a bond that has traditionally been unthinkable, since it involves taking a path to responsibility, which does not give itself to the human of humanism, but rather engages us at every turn with a recreation of ethics and reasons and ways of knowledge making, says great Gay Bradshaw, that reflects our understanding that animals are fully sentient beings. Such knowledge making demands the recognition of other animals as having life worlds as meaningful as our own. With such a paradigm shift, we have the possibility of shaping a collective future that includes as a given an ethical responsibility towards all other animals. In 1889, Nietzsche may or may not have embraced a fallen horse. In 2004, a little cat did look into the eyes of the naked philosopher, a moment which prompted Derrida to realize that animals have their point of view regarding me, and to remind us that witnessing is not a one-way line of sight. Indeed, as with Nietzsche, Derrida's story troubles the link between anthropocentrism and a tradition that, if it has not ignored animals completely, has denied them subjectivity, thus rendering them unworthy of moral concern. Furthermore, in the historical and philosophical tension between Nietzsche and Derrida, we are given to understand what philosophers and by extension, certain scientists, anthropologists, and others have refused, that the horse of Turin and Logos, the little cat of Derrida's house, tell us that our fellow animals are always already present to us in their vulnerability and their unsubstitutable singularity, and that we must understand that a future includes them in that singularity. It matters that we hear this perspective ubiquitously echoed in contemporary animal advocacy, and that includes an ethics of care for all living beings, those exploited and farmed, and those who are free living. The road to the Anthropocene has been built upon an illusion of domination. Because the anthropocentric terminus is within sight, there is little time left to take an alternate route. While this talk has been aimed at reflecting upon the power of storytelling to have us consider what a post-anthropocentric call and response ethics might accomplish in regards to the loss of animal lives, it also seeks an alternate route. What must come first, of course, is a thorough dismantling of the human hierarchies of being that have historically, philosophically, scientifically, and ethically brought us to the tragic reality of animal loss within the Anthropocene. At this moment, the question of mutual relations demands that bearing witness is not a passive activity, but a call to action regarding our responsibility towards those other living beings. It takes active imagination, such as referred to by Kelly Oliver, who asks, can we imagine an ecological subjectivity acknowledging that it exists through its relationships with the environment and those around it? I'd like to think that Nietzsche learned that he was wrong about being all too human when he encountered and embraced the horse on the streets of Turin. I'd also like to think that Derrida's cat may have something further to add to the encounter. In any case, we're charged with acknowledging the role of compassion in radically altering our relations with the more than human world. And in conclusion, if we acknowledge the precarity of other animals in regards to the Anthropocene, we must be prepared to make it count in real time and to take action predicated upon legal, political, and cultural transformations that have overturned the business as usual of human exceptionalism. If bearing witness to animal loss in the Anthropocene means becoming animal, it also involves, as Calarco says, catching sight of the fact that we as human beings occupy a shared space with animals and other enfleshed beings in ways we normally disavow. I understand this catching sight to mean recognizing that animals are not, as Heidegger would have it, poor in world. Rather, it means that during this time of the Anthropocene, bearing witness to exploitation and loss of other animals must go beyond merely giving evidence, which is what I think Manisha Deka is doing in Justice in a Multi-Species World, in which she's speaking of bearing witness as a kind of relational exchange. It is respectful of difference of otherness, and it is humble but responsible to the needs of vulnerable others. The point is, there is no witnessing without the understanding of vulnerability. So it must go beyond merely giving evidence and come to terms with the fact that as do we, individual animals live and die in an intersubjective sphere that is increasingly at risk on our watch. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We will open it up for questions at this point.
I see there are hands here.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope that this isn't taken as like the politics of dismissiveness that you referenced, because I totally agree with everything that you said, pretty much, and the need for responsiveness and empathy towards animals and the recognition of our shared being with, for sure. I guess my question is, I have a question and also like a little pushback on the story about Nietzsche to maybe clarify
Sure.
where I'm coming from. So the question is, what does this bearing witness do? You have said that, bearing witness, we can't just stop at a passive bearing witness or a passive response, that this has to be the prompt to some sort of action. So I'm wondering what bearing witness does, or what kinds of action bearing witness prompts in that way. And then its relation to the story about Nietzsche. One thing that we, like, while the story about Nietzsche and the horse is kind of contested and up for debate, it may be apocryphal, et cetera. One thing that we do know, based on textual evidence from letters that he sent directly after his collapse to his friends Peter Gast, et cetera,
Yep.
is that he, even after his collapse, did not necessarily extend understanding or compassion to absolutely everyone. He, in one of his letters after his collapse, said that anti-Semites should be shot in the street, and that he was going to take a pistol and go do it himself. So he obviously did seem to think that there are some beings or mode of being that is not worthy of existence, even after his supposed recognition of the importance of empathy with the being of another. Which to me seems to complicate the idea that simply bearing witness or developing a capacity for compassion and empathy is enough to actually change people's modes of action or their views on whether or not people should exist, etc.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good point. There's a couple of points there. First of all, I want to go in the opposite direction. The issue about developing compassion and the, have it, find real and material effects beyond just that recognition it's something that within Coetzee's work, for example, it's been written about, like, to Elizabeth Costello. Do you really think that, poetry is going to change our attitude and our treatment of animals? And perhaps not. But the point, and this, I can connect this with the image that is about Nietzsche, whether the story is apocryphal or not, is that just in terms of storytelling, there is an affect that goes along with the creation of certain images. And in a way, we can understand how literature and, like, fiction and poetry are engaged in that production of the possibility of imagining, an act of imagination. So it's to my way of thinking, there's a long way maybe to go between my standing here and when we can enact this act of imagination, because it is a long process of a paradigm shift. So what I'm focusing on here is whether or not, with the image of Nietzsche, and to combine it with Derrida, who has, basically with the recognition of the otherness of the other animal having their point of view. The point was to have us reflect upon the power of an image in terms of storytelling to hold the potential for compassion, for understanding that. So it's kind of like, I'm not situating this anywhere, but I'm just looking at the way that the image itself just allows for that experience. And in allowing for that experience, we, just wondering, like, well, no matter what he said or did he or didn't he, in a way, it doesn't even matter, because in the realm of telling the story, there's this image that seems to be, as I said, burning incandescent somehow. It's like how many scholars have said, we don't have to pay attention to this. No, yes, we do. It's a mystical awakening. No, he, had something bad for dinner. So consequently, even in the midst of all of that speculation, the image sustains itself. And that, it is an embrace of an animal in distress. suggest to us really what's at stake with this unsubstitutable singularity that Derrida speaks of, which is really contrary to the massification that we have, the aggregation, even the sense of how many billion animals are killed through the animal industrial complex each year. That finally, we understand that, as I was mentioning with Joanne MacArthur, is that these are individual beings. And it's going to take a lot, I think, to be able to understand that, which is why I was evoking Manisha's work here at the end, which is trying to think of another legal concept, which is, legal beings, which then is a way of, moving through maybe without this struggle between humans and animals. But what does it mean to be a legal being? Because if we talk about personhood gets really complicated because it's only 100 years, that the person's case happened in which, women had to be granted personhood through a struggle to even have them recognized in a legal context. So, we are in a critical phase is what I'm getting at here. And it's like all of this comes to bear. So this, do I think poetry is going to change the world? Well, maybe. I'd like to think so. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. I hope that answers your question.
That's a reasonable question.
Okay, good.
Thank you so much, Jodey. So we hear so much, you hear all those devastating statistics, and we hear all those devastating statistics, and yet we also hear from it's scholarly work, and also speaking to people and seeing these headlines, just a fierce resistance, especially with respect to eating and consumption, to make changes, and a lot of the social psychologists working on veganism and change and just personality just tell us kind of sobering conclusions about the prospect of change. So is it nonetheless kind of your view that the right type of story and stories collectively, so perhaps given that perhaps most people aren't reading these days, or segments of society aren't reading that as they are watching film, but the right type of story in a visual film product is kind of what is needed to kind of get at those adults that just aren't going to be inclined to bear witness or are going to block off because it's too much cognitive dissonance. Is that like what animal advocates should be trying to cultivate? That's the first question. And the second part is, with the power of storytelling, should our work perhaps also, or perhaps even more, be focused on human children and storytelling with them, such that they don't, get out of their identification and empathy for animals in their adulting process in so many cultures?
Well, it's funny that the part 2 of that was because I've been talking also, but just about that work about creating films and books for children that in a way it's kind of fun because they already do exist, in a certain sense of how children and young adults can relate to non-humans, companion animals, even animals on the farm or whatever. But there comes a moment in which, carnism as an ideology, as you point out, has, certainly does its work, in which there's no longer any sense between that animal that you're encouraged as a young child to be kind to and what appears on your plate. So there's this creation of this gap, which is, that's really the function of ideology anyway, is to ensure that the gap just looks as normal, natural, and necessary as air. The thing about reaching adults, I don't think there's really any one way anymore. We see, for example, a lot of work being done where there's people are advocating for a plant-based diet. That's in opposition in a way. Well, it's not really, but it is in opposition in a way to asking that people consider becoming vegan, because vegans are somewhat reviled on the planet to a certain extent because it's an ethical stance, not an environmental one. So, it's about how to bring those things together as well. So it's not, being vegan is not just trendy. Rather being plant-based is not just trendy, but there is an understanding of this interconnectedness that we have, and that, not only are we killing the planet, let's say with that kind of ideology, but that in killing the planet, this is where, okay, I'm going to step over here for one sec. This is where, that focus on being plant-based and the planet really ignores the fact that the individual animals, one by one, are the ones who are bearing the brunt of our trying to work ourselves through here, trying to work, to ways out of this dilemma. And that they have always been. And it's great that, we're trying to configure ways of existing and living on the planet in a sustainable way. But at the same time, the conversation often forgets all of it's like what Theo was talking about. They somehow end up out of the frame. So how to do it? There are many ways to, roam, I guess. I mean, this is one of them. Doing work with children is another one. Like, moving into the legal status of animals, where, the property issue is enormous. And, because we know that enables various kinds of abuses in an industry, and that talks about, for example, unnecessary suffering, where the word unnecessary is the hinge between what is possible, what you do with your property or not.
Got a question in the chat. Can you please say more about your statement that witnessing is not a one-way line of sight?
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, what I meant by that is I think often when we imagine what it means to witness something, that we are the only subject that is, having an objective, or even if it's a subjective perspective, but that nothing or no one is looking back. When I say it's a two-way street, or it's reciprocal, as Derida was saying, is the recognition that when his little cat looks at him, this cat, that there is somebody home there, that animals have their point of view regarding us, which, scientifically, in scientific research, for example, to talk about animal interiority was, deemed kind of career death. This is anthropomorphism. And so you must refer to them in objective terms, and you witness what they're doing and you record it. So I'm saying that what we're witnessing is ourselves also being witnessed by other living beings. Wherever you are, that answered the question.
Hi, Lisa Warden here. Can you hear me?
Yes, if I come over here, yes.
Yeah, hi. So I was just thinking about this idea of storytelling as a powerful tool potentially, and I've always thought, if only we could hook people up to a painometer or something where they could be enfleshed somehow, so they could experience, people who don't have an imagination to imagine the pain that animals are suffering. If there was some kind of way of hooking people up to a painometer, I've seen it with somebody hooking themselves, like creating an earthquake thing on their body, so they could experience every time there was a tremor. It was a TED talk, but maybe with virtual reality, there would still be the problem of animal representation. But I read recently that they're developing exoskeletons, so people could actually have the closest thing to sex in virtual reality, in the metaverse. I'm just wondering if people could have an animal suit of flesh where they would, I could imagine a factory farm experience or something in virtual reality where people are enfleshed virtually. But it's just a thought that came to mind because of your comments about just vulnerability for bearing witness. We need to have this capacity to be vulnerable. So anyway, it's just a thought, really.
Well, I will respond to that. I mean, there is a lot of technology that is available for you to go and, stand at a pig slaughterhouse, for example. And, a lot of people get really quite disturbed when they're asked to put on this technology. And I think the point, though, that I'd also like to make is that I don't know if we really need technology to understand suffering, and that it is before us all the time. And so, storytelling is one way, but other ways are, just about educating ourselves and recognizing that the issue of vulnerability has to do, and we just need to look at what's happening in Ukraine right now. But what we have to understand in terms of vulnerability is that, we do share this finitude with all living beings, all enfleshed beings. And so part of moving through into, I would say, another paradigm or another worldview is, and I mean, this is a huge complication to be able to articulate in a few minutes, but so I won't try. But I think we are moving into a place where we are called upon, to exercise something akin to ahimsa, which is, is to do no harm. And if you can prevent suffering in the world, why would you not want to? How's that?
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi,
Oh, there's somebody else here.
yeah. My name is Lucille Thibodeau. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I am not a philosopher. My field is literature.
Me too.
And but I have read a little bit of Emmanuel Levinas,
Mhm.
and there's a great danger. I think your talk really focuses on the fact that there's a great danger in leaving ethics without any emotional impact at all, leaving it with no connection with the living feel and the unsystematic complexity of life, leaving it without imagination.
Mhm.
Now, the little I know of Levinas, and I would like you to address this if you're familiar with him, I'm sure you are more than I am. For him, ethics is an ongoing engagement with particular literal and metaphorical, what he calls literal and metaphorical faces. He speaks of the rapport of the face to the face.
Mhm.
And of course, the face with a small f it reveals age and gender and ethnicity and race and even socioeconomic status. But face with the uppercase F is what seizes us through imagination, seizes us with love. I am seized by love for the face, either whether it's a tomato plant, an alligator, or a dog, a child. That face calls out to my imagination, calls out for compassion.
Mhm.
Am I understanding what Levinas has to say here correctly? And if I am, can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think the short version of that is that traditionally, or I would say conceptually, the face for Levinas isn't necessarily the face of a non-human face, even though he does speak of, tomatoes, etc. That in fact, there is still this gap, if you will, between a face, a certain face that is worthy of moral and ethical concern. But what I want to say about that worthiness is that always implied is that face that is worthy of ethical concern is made available by virtue of a face that you don't see that is at the periphery, which is the face of the other that does not that is not accorded the same ethical concern. It's kind of like the human-animal divide, in which we understand intersectionally how the issue of the animal has been, instrumental in, in all forms of exploitation, not only of the idea that animals themselves are themselves, but that people become animalized. So that there is only a certain face that is implied here, and it is not the face of the other.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right, we're out of time for any other questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Castricano, for that
Thank you.
wonderful talk. And thank you again also to the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy for funding the lecture series. Also to our co-presenter again at the University of Victoria, the Center for Global Studies, and to everyone who attended online and in person today. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. See you everybody later. Thank you.